All right. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jen Lampton. Been around in the Drupal world for a while. It turns out I've now been doing Drupal for 14.5 years. And much to my shock, I realized that I have been doing Backdrop development for half that time now. So I remember when I had first started being around in the Drupal community for that amount of time, I actually started to feel like I knew what I was talking about. And so now I'm like, oh my gosh, I should know what I'm talking about for Backdrop too by now, which is kind of shocking. This presentation is a lot like one I did for SFDUG in the past. In that instance, I did an example upgrade of a really simple Backdrop site that I did in about a day. This time I'm hoping to talk about some more complicated things that come up when you're moving from Drupal to Backdrop, and hopefully a tool that will help with those. Let's see, I had a question. How many of you, and feel free to use your thumbs up reaction if you don't want to show your face or raise your hand or anything, but how many of you have used Backdrop before? Wow, that's great. That's like half of you. That's fantastic. Okay, so you are probably pretty familiar with what it is. I'll try and breeze through some of those slides pretty quickly. Let me go ahead and turn on the screen share and we can get into more of the question-y stuff. Okay, here we go. All right. So you get to have this battle where you figure out where your Zoom goes compared to everything else you need to see. All right, upgrading to Drupal 7 from Drupal 7 to Backdrop. What is Backdrop? It's a Drupal fork. You guys all know that already. We essentially took a really, really early version of Drupal 8. You can consider it Drupal 7 for all important differences, and modernized it. Drupal 7 is rather old software by now. And so we wanted to make sure that Backdrop would have all of the things you would expect of new software. So it's mobile first, it has HTML5, has a built-in rich text editor. It has a lot of the same things that you'll find in Drupal 8, like configuration management, all of the field types that went in, views and ctools and core, media browsers, stuff like that. Essentially everything you would expect of a modern Drupal should be in Backdrop as well. It also includes a lot of the most popular Drupal 7 contributed module features. So things like token, path auto, and redirector in core. We also added, I think it's like 74 total contrib modules. Not all of them went in as modules. Some of them are just integrated into the system. So you might not even know they're in there. Things like scheduler allows you to schedule content in the future, and comment closer allows you to automatically close comments after a period of time. So just stuff that we figured if it was in there, people would use it, but people might not necessarily think to install a module like that. It's fast. So one of the things we were really focused on when we first started working on Backdrop was making it perform better than Drupal 7. Drupal 7 is already something that started to demand specialized hosting to run a Drupal 7 site, specifically at scale. And we wanted to make sure that Backdrop could run on shared hosting. So it performs faster than Drupal 7 and consumes less server resources. Drupal also has a reputation for being not very user-friendly. We wanted to focus on improving that. So we spent a lot of time on a lot of little things that we think will make the experience of using Backdrop more pleasurable. Things like making terminology consistent and putting things where you expect to find them in the interface. In the 7 years that I've been working on Backdrop, there's been more than 600 user experience commits made to core. So why might you want to upgrade it to Backdrop? A couple of the pitches that I give when my clients are trying to decide where they want to go with their current Drupal 7 sites is evaluating the site that they currently have. When you are going from Drupal to Backdrop, it is an upgrade. So that means you're taking your current site and you're just switching it to a new system. You're not rebuilding. So if you feel like your site is old and clunky or it doesn't fit the current needs of your business, you might want this opportunity to build a new site. But if you're happy with your old site, it might be worth considering an upgrade instead of moving to a different platform. If you want the same functionality you have now, we have gone through a handful of upgrades where the modules that you use on Drupal 7 aren't done in exactly the same way in Drupal 8 or Drupal 9, so you have to get the same feature in a different way. If you want exactly the same thing without having to think about it, you can usually move to Backdrop. Even if the module isn't available for Backdrop, it's usually much easier to make it work for Backdrop than to try and find comparable solutions out of different modules. Backdrop, of course, can do more than your Drupal 7 site can. A lot of people think it's a lighter weight system that maybe isn't made for sites that, big clunky Drupal 7 sites, but it should be able to do just as much, if not more, than your current Drupal site can do now. If you want a simpler editor and or administrative experience, Backdrop has not only focused on the editorial experience, which is just creating content, but also is very focused on a higher level, what we call architect, or Drupal called site builder, in terms of how, the kinds of people who are building views and layouts and dealing with context and complicated things like that. We've been focusing on making that experience much easier for people as well. And if you want ongoing improvements to your software, and this is really the one thing that would set you apart from sticking with Drupal 7 long-term support, Backdrop has new releases that come out every 4 months. They include new features that go into core. There's constantly security updates and bug fixes and other stuff going into it. That's the only thing you're going to lose if you stay on Drupal 7 after end of life. And another thing it's important to consider is the philosophy for Backdrop. This is something that when we first started working on Backdrop, trying to figure out how do you take an open source software project, fork it from one that's already there, and prevent it from doing exactly the same thing that the one you forked did. And so we sat down and came up with a philosophy to figure out what it is that's important for Backdrop. And every time we make a decision about things that are going into Backdrop core, we measure them against the project's philosophy to make sure they're a good fit. Our mission statement is that Backdrop CMS enables people to build highly customized websites affordably through collaboration open source software. A couple of things that are different here than the Drupal philosophy is that Backdrop is for people. It's not for developers, it's for all people. And it's specifically focused on websites as opposed to web applications or frameworks. So we build websites for people. If you have a need for a framework or an application or just a front end or just a back end, Backdrop might not be, you can do it on Backdrop, but it might not be the best fit. We just do websites. It's made for all people, not necessarily just developers. Principles, easier updates. Backwards compatibility is important. That means that the transition from Drupal 7 to Backdrop will be the hardest upgrade you ever have to do. This is the same thing you're seeing has evolved more recently in Drupal as well. Simplicity, writing code that the majority of people can understand. So rather than saying we're going to adopt a specific principle or specific pattern, we're going to say every time we have to decide on something to do, we're going to try and pick the language or the format that most people understand. The biggest example of this is where we went and put in configuration management. We chose to use JSON files. Drupal 8 chose to use YAML. Does it really matter which is which? No, but the reason we decided to use JSON is because the majority of web developers are already familiar with JSON syntax. That will change over time. Focus, we only include features that benefit the majority. So every time we're evaluating a module, adding it to core, we have sort of an 80% rule. If this module will be used by 80% of sites that are running Backdrop, it can go in core. If it doesn't, it should stay in contrib. Extensibility, we want to make sure that Backdrop can be easily customized. This is the thing that sets Drupal apart, is the fact that there are thousands of modules for you to be able to choose from. Those modules allow you to do exactly what you need to do with your website. Drupal's great. It wouldn't be as great if it was core alone. Backdrop is Drupal, so it also has to remain really extensible. So that means every time we do add something like a new feature to core, it also still has to have the ability to be customized in the same way that Backdrop core does now. Security, we want to keep sites and people safe. We have a security team. We do security releases coordinated with Drupal. More questions about security we can answer later. And performance, this is something I talked about before about how it's really important to make Backdrop fast and use a minimum amount of system resources. This is also something that we consider as we're making changes to core. If we see something that we suspect might affect the performance of the site, we tag that issue with needs benchmarks, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't affect everybody negatively before we put in that change. Releasing on time is also something Drupal's come around to recently, that we want to make sure that all of our releases go out when we want them to. So that means that if we have a release date scheduled for September and the feature we want to get it isn't ready, doesn't matter. We're still going to release Drupal in September. Sorry, we're going to release Backdrop in September, and we're going to push that feature to the next release. And that makes it really easy for companies to plan when they're going to need to budget for updates. It makes it really easy to developers to plan when they need to set aside time to work on things. And it does keep everything rolling out like clockwork, which is great. In Freedom, we obviously inherited the GPL license from Drupal, but we believe in freedom. We like open source code, and we are committed that Backdrop will always remain free. All right, so what kinds of sites are upgrading? There's two sites that I've seen upgrading to Backdrop most commonly. And the first one are very simple sites, and these are sites that didn't feel like it was worth investing more than they originally spent in the website to move it to a new platform. So simple Drupal 7 site, moving it to WordPress would take a lot of time, or moving it to Drupal 8 might cost a lot of money, and they're not interested in investing in it because the site itself is really simple, and they don't necessarily feel like in reinvesting in it is going to be worthwhile. And the other thing we're seeing is websites that are heavily customized, and that usually means a lot of custom code had been written for them. So they had previously invested a lot into getting exactly the functionality they want, and people aren't interested in reinvesting that same time and effort into doing it again on another platform. So I did mention earlier, I did a very similar version of this talk where I demonstrated a upgrade that I did in a day. This one we're going to talk more on the other end of sites that are upgrading. If you have a site that fits any of those requirements, or you're in agreement with the why you might want to move to Backdrop, that's great. So there's a couple of different things you need to consider when you're actually making that move. The first one is researching everything that's necessary. The second one is getting your Drupal 7 site ready. And then the third one is actually doing the upgrade. I find the hardest part of the process is usually the research, especially for people who don't have a lot of hands-on experience with Backdrop. Trying to figure out how to get from something you have and know and understand in Drupal 7 to something you don't know, problem you don't know how to solve in Backdrop can be really hard. So in terms of research, there's a couple of things you should look at. Looking at your current theme is one of them. Looking at your current layouts, and this is something new in Backdrop, can talk about more detail later, is also going to be useful. Looking at the modules your site's currently using, very important. And so I'm going to go through each of these things in a little bit more detail, and I'll show you a tool that'll help with these reviews in a little bit. So in reviewing your theme, I have been most successful at pitching an upgrade from Drupal 5 to Drupal 6, Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, Drupal 7 to Backdrop, along with something that people can see. Like if you deliver exactly the same website afterwards as before, sometimes people don't feel like they've gotten value out of that investment. But if you can do an upgrade along with a redesign, sometimes people are really happy with doing that investment together. So if you want to do a new theme, it's a good time to do it while doing an upgrade. But if you are happy with your current theme, you can port it from Drupal to Backdrop, but you need to be aware of the differences. So porting it is one way to do it. Doing a new one, you might install one from Contrib, you might create a new one that's custom. But you might want to look at the time and effort required in doing either one. So if you want to look at your current theme and evaluate differences between Backdrop and Drupal, there are a few major things that are different, and then a lot of really minor things. The biggest things are the major changes in Backdrop, which is switching from a renderable page array into the layout system. And that the way that themes work in Backdrop and the way that themes work in Drupal are significantly different, in that in Backdrop you can change your themes and nothing else will change. Your block placements won't change, none of that will matter. So you should be able to change them and change them back, and there's no other configurations associated with where your content appears on your page. All of that configuration is done in the layout system. And that means that we had to pull things like regions out of themes and put them into layouts. There's also a bunch of really tiny changes, mostly changes to semantic markup. In Drupal, there were a lot of divs and a lot of IDs. In Backdrop, we use tags like article, nav, section, aside. We've switched to classes in almost every instance. These changes are not necessary if you have a Drupal 7 theme and you've overridden all these templates and you've left all of these divs in here. You don't have to think about them at all. But if you are taking the time to do a review of your theme, you might decide you want some of the new markup that's in Backdrop. And so I recommend looking at it anyway and deciding, is this something you want to invest in updating your theme? The way that the various layers of processing happened in the theme system was really confusing in Drupal 7. And so we tried to remove some of those layers in Backdrop. Most notably, and that everyone will encounter right away, is that the process layer is gone. And the process layer is a layer in Drupal that took arrays and flattened them into strings. And what we did in Backdrop is just put that conversion directly into the template file. So this is something you can see in Twig and Drupal 8 as well, where we decided to give front-end developers a little bit more credit and just show them all of the magic that was happening behind the scenes rather than burying it in a different layer. And so we've done that in Backdrop in the same way we did it in Drupal 8, only without the extra layer of abstraction that's Twig. So this is just done directly in PHP in the template file. We also have function calls in the template files for the same reason. We want to make sure front-end developers are knowing exactly where this stuff is coming from. So just printing things like Backdrop get CSS and Backdrop JS directly into the file. Layouts are the biggest difference. In Backdrop, it comes with 10 layouts in core. These are Bootstrap grid system layouts. We use Bootstrap 4, but the 10 layouts that are provided in core aren't going to accommodate every need you have on your site, especially if you did anything really custom in Drupal 7 with panels or built your own custom layouts in your theme. You're going to find that the layouts in Backdrop are a good starting point, but they might not get you all the way there. And so you might need to create your own layouts. And there are a couple of different ways you can do that in Backdrop. You can do it in code in the same way that you would create a custom theme. You have an info file, template file, CSS and PHP files optional. And you can define where all of your regions are going to be. But you can also use the user interface if you don't want to write code for it. So if you look at the layout templates in core, you can compare them to the approximate layouts that are on your site now, and you can figure out whether you want to rebuild those using the user interface or writing code. And that should help you decide how much work is involved in that transition. If you have a site that uses something like Panoply or panel nodes or Panelizer, that's the kind of thing where you can get an individual layout for every single node. That's a lot harder to transition. And so making an accounting of, okay, well, these are all the places where we've got custom layouts, and thinking about how you're going to move this into Backdrop will help with the estimate process. All right, so to review modules, there's a couple of different things you should look at. Backdrop has a different set of core modules than Drupal 7 did. So you are going to have to take a look at the core modules that are in Drupal 7 and make sure they're all still in Backdrop. You're going to have to look at your contributed modules and make sure that there's versions available for Backdrop for the things that you're using in Drupal 7. And you're going to have to take a look at your custom modules. And we'll talk about what you should review with each of those. So there are a handful, I think maybe 8 modules that were removed from core and Backdrop. And some of them have comparable replacements that are in core. So something like the Drupal 7 dashboard module has a comparable Backdrop dashboard module, works very differently, does the same sort of thing. Things like the toolbar module has been replaced by admin menu. So there are some things you won't necessarily need to replace, but there are a handful of modules that have been moved from core to contrib, and a handful of things that we don't have alternatives for, like overlay. So if you wanted overlay, you're gonna need to figure out if you can make do with like the core modal system instead, something like that. So I don't know that there are a lot of modules in Backdrop core that don't exist in contrib, that were in Drupal 7 core that aren't in Backdrop core. The only one I could find was poll. And I know for a fact that I have a site coming up that's going to need that. So I don't think it's going to be for very long. I'll have to find another example for this talk. But there are, it is worth looking at and seeing if you're going to need to port anything from core to contrib. Looking at your contributed modules is pretty straightforward. There is a tool called Backdrop Upgrade Status that I will demonstrate in a little bit that will give you a list of the status of any of the modules that are currently on your Drupal 7 site and where they are for Backdrop. It also includes some information if the module's been moved into core or if there's anything tricky about that upgrade. If we know about it, it's going to be in the module and it's going to be documented for you. Hopefully will help. In reviewing your custom modules, there's a couple of things that you should look at specifically. in particular, we have left a lot of the systems in place from Drupal 7, things like the variables system. So if you've heavily used variables in Drupal 7, it's still there and you can use it in Backdrop. But you also have the option of converting those variables to configuration. And so that's another thing where you're going to have to look at and say, like, are these variables things we're going to want to export and deploy from different environments? And if so, we should maybe consider moving those to configuration, and there's going to be some time associated with that. But if not, those modules could work with as small changes as maybe just an update to the info file. So a couple of major things in terms of changing your modules. You obviously need to tell Backdrop that the module works for it. Backdrop also likes to know what type of add-on it is. In Backdrop, we have modules, themes, and layouts. There's also profiles. We're also coming up with something we're going to call recipes. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of add-ons. And so we have a new type definition in there. You need to add that to your info file. And then after that, if your module works, you're done. Woohoo! If there's other things you want to change, there's some pretty great documentation you can follow on all of the various differences. Configuration management, for the most part, if it's just a variable, you can change from variable set to variable get. If you have something more complicated like a CTools exportable, you might want to make an entire configuration set rather than just a single configuration value. And there's some good documentation on how to do that too. All of the changes that have been made to the Backdrop API are documented on our API site under a section called Change Records, and every single change should have an example of what your code looked like before and what it would look like after. In general, Backdrop code is not very different from Drupal code. If you have experience working with Drupal code, you should just be able to open the Backdrop files, read them from top to bottom, and everything will be familiar. There's a couple of new hooks. There's the layout system that's new and the configuration system that's new, and everything else is essentially Drupal 7 core and contrib merged together. The second step of moving from Backdrop to Drupal, after you've Drupal to Backdrop, after you've gotten all of your modules, layouts, themes, all documented, is to figure out how to get your Drupal 7 site ready for that upgrade. And that includes making sure that you're on the latest releases for Drupal 7 core and your contrib projects. Doing maybe, if you want to, some cleanup. So if you have content that you're not using or content that you know you're not going to use in the future, you could delete that and clean that up. If you have any modules that you might have turned on to experiment with but decided not to use in the end, making sure those are fully uninstalled. And then if you have any configuration that's managed by custom modules or features, things like views, those can get converted automatically for you from Drupal to Backdrop as long as they're in the database. But if they're in code, the code won't be there when you get to the Backdrop site. And so there's nothing for it to upgrade. So that means you have to take time to take that view and make sure it's saved in the database. If it's in the database, it'll get updated for you. And then the step 3 is actually doing the upgrade. And that just means taking your Drupal site, removing the code, dropping in the Backdrop code, and then running update.php, which sounds very simple. If anyone has done an upgrade from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, you know this is not always quite that simple. I like to do my upgrades usually 2 or 3 times. I do it once just to get it all the way into Backdrop, and then do a bunch of QA, and then I might fix some things and do it again. After I do it, I usually will adjust things as needed. The cool thing about doing an upgrade the second time for Backdrop is that once you get it in its finished state, you can commit your configuration. And then the second time you do the upgrade, you don't ever have to do any of that reconfiguring again, because you can just do a config sync and it'll take the configuration and import it. So if you need to do something like build new layouts, or I don't know, you added a new view, those changes aren't ever going to be lost as you redo your updates again. Just sync them back in. All right, so I'm going to do some show and tell here in a minute, but before I do that, I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions. Put you all to sleep. Okay. So my favorite part of the research process is going through an entire Drupal 7 site and trying to make a, I used to make this giant spreadsheet that included all this information about all the stuff that's on it. But now I don't have to do that anymore, because I have been working on a module called the Backdrop upgrade status. Let me just do this. And what this does is it will check all of the modules that are currently installed on your Drupal 7 site, and it'll compare them against Backdrop compatible versions, and it'll give you a report of what's ready and what's not. So we'll let this churn through to generate that list for us. It uses the same thing as the Drupal core update manager, only instead of checking Drupal.org for new modules, it's checking backdropcms.org. And then GitHub as well if it doesn't find them there. And then after it does this check, I've also had it create a report page, which includes some of the statistics of other stuff that you might want to check on your Backdrop site. So at the very top here, I have like an upgrade to-do list, which is really more like a to-review list. But what it does is it goes through and lists anything that could be problematic in your upgrade. So this site, for example, is using the minimal install profile in Drupal 7. If it had used something like the Pantheon or Acquia Drupal install profile, that could present a problem when upgrading to Backdrop. And so you might need to change your profile first. There's a module called Profile Switcher. And if you needed it, this section would recommend installing the Profile Switcher module and changing to a profile that is supported in Backdrop. Or if you're using something like, I don't know, CRM has its own profile, that it would tell you just to make sure that you have the Backdrop version that you're upgrading to instead of the core Backdrop version. And then for core modules, we also have a list here of all of the modules that are in core. If you are using anything that has been removed from core, it will tell you what the right answer is to do for that particular module, right? So we know for a fact that there's a version of aggregator in Contrib. So this list will tell you to install the Contrib version. If you use something like, I don't know, dashboard, doesn't look like a dashboard, it would just say like there is a version of dashboard in Backdrop core and you should use that instead. So it has very specific instructions on what to do for any problem you might have encountered, or it might have encountered. For contributed modules, I'm not sure if this update is done. There we go. Okay, so for contributed modules, it will take the Drupal version and go look for a Backdrop version. If there is a Backdrop version, it will tell you that it's available. It will give you the ability to download or review release notes for it. For some things that don't have Backdrop versions that you don't need, it'll also tell you, like the boxes module, for example, was replaced by core configuration management. It tells you like what version that went in. If a module has a development version, so this would be a version of the module that doesn't have an official release yet, it'll show up here in yellow and say, hey, there are people who are working on this contrib module, but it doesn't have a supported release. So that'll show up in yellow. And if there's a module that doesn't have a Backdrop version yet, it will say that's not yet available for Backdrop. It'll give you an indicator here that needs to be looked into more. So that could mean that nobody started it yet. It could mean that someone has started and failed, didn't bother to put it in contrib. But that information should all be in this report. So you should be able to take this and figure out like, okay, well, Cloudflare is going to need some help. It looks like Slick Views module isn't out yet. This didn't stop. It didn't get all of them in that one pass, but it would say that Viewport isn't ready yet. Everything else should have a available version. And then when you get to the report page in the contrib section, it'll give you some instructions about what to do for contributed modules. In most cases, if you had a contributed module enabled in Drupal 7, you would leave the module enabled, you would run the upgrade, and then you would end up with an upgraded version of that configuration that module managed at the end of it. But there are some things that, for example, boxes, right? That's something that configuration management handles. You need to know, okay, well, what happens to my boxes content? And it turns out that the boxes content is stored in the blocks table. And so if you uninstall the boxes module, you're only removing the unique identifiers. And as boxes get converted to, or blocks get converted to Backdrop, they get those back again. So you don't need to do anything special for your boxes upgrade. You can disable and uninstall the module and they'll get converted in the way that you would expect to Backdrop. But you might not know that without this tool. Like boxes is different than a lot of other things. There's some other modules that might require special handling, things like This might not be a good example. I don't know if there are any in here. So yeah, there aren't any here with special handling, but if there was anything special you needed to do, like you had to do one thing before you upgraded and another thing after you upgraded, those would all be documented here in this list of recommendations. So it's essentially a community knowledge pool of, oh, I ran into this problem when I was upgrading, so there's now this documentation for the next person on how to do it in the recommendation column. For custom modules, this isn't going to give you a lot of help because custom modules are obviously unique. But what I'm hoping to do is to use the coder upgrade module to detect any API hooks that might have been removed from Backdrop, in particular, the ones around like hook page alter, for example. Anything that modifies the page array isn't going to be there in Backdrop, and there are alternative ways to achieve those same things. And we could just check for those hooks in these modules and add a little indicator here saying, hey, this is going to be replaced by that. The coder upgrade module for Backdrop also does a pretty good job of taking all of your code and converting it. As long as there's a sensible conversion, it'll try and do that. But it won't replace an entire hook with a different hook. It doesn't do that yet. So we could at least document that here in terms of what it knows it needs to do. And then another thing that this report does is it gives you a summary of all of the other data on your site. So like user account data, content types. If you have any content types that don't have any nodes in them, for example, it'll give you a recommendation here. You might want to delete the content type before the upgrade. Information on field data. It'll tell you how many values for each field are in the database. And so if you have a field on a particular content type that doesn't have any values in it, it's like, do you really need this field? And there's no harm in taking all of the stuff and upgrading it into Backdrop if you think you might need it later, or you don't know what it's doing there. But you could just leave it alone. But it can be really helpful if you're like, oh yeah, I remember I set that up one time and it was just an experiment or had a name called test or something like that. You would know it would be safe to remove something like that from here. There's also a couple of other contrib modules that it'll give you some data on. So this includes information on paragraphs. Paragraphs does have a version for Backdrop, so it should upgrade smoothly, but this will just give you a summary of what you have. And then features is another one that's especially tricky. For views, in general, you want all of your views to be in the database before you upgrade. You can hang on just a minute. I seem to have a dog that wants to leave the room, and she's going to keep bothering me until we do. So I would just.
I thought I heard something. I was like, I'm looking around for my dog. No. Why is my dog whining?
My dog. I'm just gonna let her up. Okay. So she went to the vet today. And she wouldn't normally be in here, but she's had a rough day. So medicated. Okay, so where was I? Views. So in order for views to upgrade from Backdrop to Drupal, they need to be in your database. So this just shows you a report that shows you which views are in your database. If you had any that were in code, it would say, edit this view and save it into the database, and then it would be ready to upgrade. Views are pretty straightforward. You just hit edit, save, and they'll be ready to go. Features are a little bit more complicated because depending on what features component is being used, the solution to get that back in the database can be different. And so there is a module called Unfeatureize, which includes support for, I don't know, maybe 10 different CTools plugin types. And it'll help get all of that content from the code and features that was managing back into the database where Backdrop can upgrade it for you. And this, if you have content and features, the report will tell you that you could use Unfeatureize to restore them into the database. And it will detect all of the components that it is in a given feature, and it'll say, okay, we know for sure that this is going to unfeatureize with no problem. But if there's a component in there that the Unfeatureize module doesn't currently support, it'll give you an indication that says, hey, Unfeatureize doesn't currently support box. If you need to figure out how to get that back into the database, you're sort of on your own. So this is hopefully going to give you enough information to figure out how to manage your features on your own, or what it is you need to look at least in terms of figure out how to get that into a place that'll upgrade smoothly. So yeah, I'm hoping that, so I'm working on a fairly complicated site right now. I have 3 more coming that are all sort of built in the same way. They're all using context and features. So that's, you know, one of the standards that Drupal 7, a lot of people adopted. And so I'm hoping to be able to go through and document how, you know, this goes for this first site, and then in the second site I'll have all the information you need to be able to get a really accurate estimate ahead of time, and I'll be able to compare the finished number, the start number, and see how it goes. But yeah, it's definitely a work in progress, but I am really excited about how much information this is going to give anyone who needs to move their Drupal site to Backdrop. Let's see, was there anything else? Oh, okay, so I have a list here of things that I've sort of come across in doing, I don't know, this is like my 3rd site that I've used this on. But I'm also curious as to problems that other people might run into as they're upgrading. So if any of you are thinking about upgrading a Drupal 7 site to Backdrop and you want help estimating a particular thing, there's an issue here for the Backdrop upgrade status module that's trying to figure out what it is we should include. And right now, I've got all of the things that I wanted originally, but I've come up with some new ideas. Like, you know, there's a pretty clear panels, so layouts relationship. We could probably help document how to do that. And context are something that is included with layouts. And so trying to figure out how to provide the same context UI you have in Drupal 7 to a layout context in Backdrop is also something that we could work on. So I've got some sort of lists here of other things I think we should include in the report to help document how to get from your Drupal 7 site to your Backdrop site. So if anyone runs into anything, please update this issue. Let me know what it is you want, and we can work on getting those added. Are there any questions on that?
Just a real quick question is, so everything's done, contribution is done on GitHub?
So this particular module, Backdrop Upgrade Status, is available on Drupal.org, but this is a mirror of our GitHub project. And because it's being created and maintained by mostly people who are working on Backdrop, and all of Backdrop contributed stuff is done on GitHub, that's where this project lives. So I'm not sure if that was a question specifically about this project or Backdrop in general.
Backdrop in general, but yeah, that kind of, you answered that in that, so.
Yeah, so Backdrop's contrib space works a little bit different than Drupal in that a contributed project isn't necessarily owned by one person. It is owned by the community as a whole. So if you take a contributed module and you want to give it back to Backdrop, you're transferring it into the contrib group. And the contrib group is a group in which a lot of people will have commit access over that project. The security team has direct access to be able to commit and make releases to that project on your behalf. We have a bug squad team that is able to merge pull requests that have been marked RTBC for 2 weeks or more. And so it's sort of more of a community effort in maintaining the projects than it is leaving it to an individual person. That said, every project does have its own maintainers in the same way that Drupal did. Just all of that work happens kind of collaboratively in one group on GitHub. There are, of course, projects that are Backdrop projects that don't exist in the contrib group. Things like Civi CRM is a great example where they have their own GitHub group and they manage their own work over there, and it's much easier to do that. And so you can install contributed projects from anywhere. And it just happens that most of the work that's going on in Backdrop is in that contrib group, but it is all on GitHub. Are there any other questions? Let's see, hold on, there's a chat. Mostly people leaving. Okay, I'm going to drop in some links here. Here is a link to the project for Backdrop upgrade status. And here's the link to the GitHub issue where we're adding all these new features. And again, the goal with this project is to make it not only easy to estimate how to move from Drupal 7 to Backdrop specifically for the more complicated sites, but also document anything that our community knows specifically in how to get from A to B that you're going to need to know if you're going to follow those same steps in the future. That's all I got, guys.
All righty.
Else?
Thank you very much. That was very informative. I always like watching the way you've taken some of the problems from the D7 to D8 and a new approach to them. That's very nice.
Thank you.
So Bob asked, is the key to run Backdrop upgrade status and use that as the basis? So Backdrop upgrade status is a module that I put on my Drupal 7 site ahead of time to see what we're facing. And then when I'm actually doing the upgrade, I'll use that to prepare my Drupal 7 database. So it essentially checks what's currently on your Drupal 7 site and tells you if it's ready to run that update.php script on Backdrop yet or not. So I usually have a copy of my old Drupal 7 site sort of side by side with the new site I'm upgrading, and I'll use that to generate the database export. So I'll go to Drupal 7, get it all ready, make sure everything's back in the database, make sure the upgrade status report says everything is good. And then when it does, I do the database dump, import it into my site that I'm upgrading, and then I run update.php directly on it there. So it should serve both as an estimation tool and as a tool to tell you if your database is in a state that's ready to upgrade yet or not.
It's pretty cool.
All righty. Well, I'm going to drop because there's a hockey game on that's very important to me. So I'm going to go nights for it, and that's recorded, I hope. So
All right. Thank you so much.
thank you very much. And
meetup.
take care, everybody.
There's is there anything like Drush or something for Backdrop?
Yeah, so Drush works for Backdrop as
Oh,
well as Drupal. Yeah, I use it on both projects at the same time. Most of the commands are the same. So like Drush DL will download the project from GitHub instead of Drupal.org, and Drush, I don't know, ULI will log you into your Backdrop site. All of that stuff should be exactly the same. The one thing that's different is the config import and config export was a little bit different because Backdrop reads all of its config directly off disk every time we don't have a database cache. So you still can do a config import and a config export, but what it's just doing is synchronizing your staging directory with your production directory. So the commands for those are a little different. It's like bcim and bcix instead of cim and cix, but almost everything else is the same. And we also have people in our community working on a comparable tool called B, because we're feeling like the long-term direction of Drush is more towards Symfony-based command line tool that's going to evolve differently in the future. And we really just need the stuff that Drush does now. And so rather than we're using Drush 8, and Drush 9 is really different. So rather than trying to backward everything that's in Drush 9, we're just taking everything that's in Drush 8 and readapting it as a assembler tool called B. But yeah, I use them both all the time.
And then can you install all of Backdrop using Drush then?
I think so. I haven't tried that. I would assume. I usually just run like I don't know. I would imagine so. I usually just do the command line copy database import and then use the user interface to run the installer. But I don't see why you couldn't do that using
I'm just thinking like if we were to automate some installation backend and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then for like simple sites, for like really simple sites, you mentioned the two scenarios. The one you were walking us through, I would imagine, was that a simple site? That was not, right? Like that was with all the complex things and all the things going on. for the simple site, it should be a straightforward. Is it a straightforward conversion, or
Yeah.
how does
So
that work?
there's another, I don't know if there's a video online, but there's an example of this talk that I did where I upgraded an entire Drupal 7 site in one day to Backdrop. And that included porting a contributed module that wasn't ported yet, adapting a custom module that was already there, and adapting the theme, and doing the whole thing in less than a day, and going from Drupal 7 to Backdrop finished product. So yeah, as long as all of your content is in the database, or in that site, I think it even had views exported to code. It was really straightforward. I think it was using panels, but there were only like 4 or 5 panels. And all of this just came across really easily.
So for simple sites, is there any way to automate this?
Well, for that site, I mean, there isn't much to automate. Like, so putting your views in the database is the only thing I would think that you need to do. And then you just run update.php, which already does the update. But yeah, I mean, I could imagine there's, I think there's even, so the unfeaturized module has Drush commands. So you could use the Drush commands to unfeaturize those views, put them back in the database, and then it would run the, you could run the update from the command line.
And then your Backdrop, what is your module called? Backdrop status, or
Backdrop upgrade status.
Backdrop upgrade status. Does that generate a script to migrate? Like if everything was cleaned, could you generate a script from that to say like, oh, run the script? No.
Well, if everything is clean, the only thing that's left to do is run update.php.
Got it. Okay.
So hopefully it wouldn't be a very long script.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you
I
could
got
definitely do that.
Yeah. Okay. This looks good.
Yeah, the tricky part, I think, was, people kept running into the same problems, and I'm like, oh, but that has a solution. But then I realized it wasn't written down anywhere, so of course nobody knew what it was unless they'd run into it before. And so I was like, why don't we just make a giant report where we can say, like, we know for sure aggregator and core has aggregator and contrib. Let's just link to it and be like, download this contrib module. And
yeah, I like how you have the recommendations there as well. So that was awesome.
Yeah, that I think is the thing that's going to save me the most time in the future. A year from now, when I don't remember any of that, it's
Yeah.
going to be useful.
Any other questions before I stop recording? I looked, Jen, we did not record last year's session because it was right before we started
Recording things.
recording. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I might have, I think I did something similar at Drupal Camp Colorado last year that was recorded, so I'll check for that. But yeah.